We're very pleased to have Professor Valerie M. Hudson, Professor of Political Science, with us today. In the past year, she's been featured on USA Today. Her research has been featured in USA Today and on the Today Show. I think the turnout here is an indication of another aspect, and that is in surveys that the Kennedy Center has done, she consistently ranks as one of the most popular and most effective teachers at BYU, and I think that's clear. Let me just tell you a few things about Professor Hudson that you may not have known. She was awarded the Carl G. Mazer in Excellence Teaching Award, which is proof positive of the point I just made. She graduated magna cum laude with a BA in Political Science and a minor in Russian and International Policy from BYU. She received her MA and PhD from The Ohio State University in 1983 and later taught at Otterbein College, the Northwestern University, and Rutgers University before returning to BYU in 1987. She served as the Director of Graduate Studies for the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies and now has returned to full-time teaching and research. She is the author of numerous books, monographs, and scholarly publications. Please welcome Professor Valerie Hudson, who will be speaking on Bare Branches, Security Implications of Asia's Surplus Male Population. Professor Hudson.
I'm delighted to be here and delighted to see all of you. I see a number of faces that I know from my classes and a number of faces of colleagues. I'm grateful to have you here. Yesterday I picked up the New York Times, and they had a fascinating op-ed. It was about an aspect of what's going on in Iraq that we don't often hear about. Let me read just a couple of paragraphs now. A single word is on the lips of women here in Baghdad. The word is Himayah, or security. With an intensity reminiscent of how they feared Saddam Hussein, women now fear the abduction, rape, and murder that has become rampant here since his regime fell. Life for Iraqi women has been reduced to one need that must be met before anything else can happen. Under Saddam, we could drive, we could walk down the street until 2 in the morning, a young designer told me as she bounced her 4-year-old on her lap. Who would have thought the Americans could have made it worse for women? This is liberation. Later on, the author goes on to suggest that without Himayah for women, there will be no place for democracy to grow in Iraq. This raises some interesting points I think that resonate with the LDS community, as to whether the security of a nation is somehow connected with the security of women in a society. For some who believe that security is completely divorced from such issues of security, I undertook a research project to suggest that when women face exaggerated oppression within a society, the security of that society suffers. Let me go ahead and discuss that. What I'm looking at in particular is selection against daughters in Asia, particularly female infanticide, but also the new phenomenon of female fetus abortion. Since approximately 1985, it is no longer necessary to wait for the birth of a child to determine whether it is a girl whose life will be snuffed out or a boy whose life you will save and whose life you will celebrate. As a result, sex ratios, due to this new technology, sex ratios in Asia are becoming skewed to a degree perhaps unprecedented in human history. In order to figure out exactly what's going on with these sex ratios, let's take a look at some figures here. All right. Maybe about the best I can get. That's a little bit better. All right. Jot these down in your notes, otherwise you'll be lost the rest of the lecture. Okay? We need to understand some of the normal sex ratios in order to understand the abnormal sex ratios. The normal birth sex ratio is about 105 to 107 boys born per 100 girls born. Okay? The normal early childhood sex ratios, that is, if you looked at the sex ratios, you average them over age 0 to 4, probably be about 105 would be the norm. The normal sex ratio then for children after that early childhood period is about 1 to 1, about 100 boys per 100 girls. So we have more boys being born, but we have more boys dying in the early childhood period, usually due to congenital illnesses or greater susceptibility to certain contagious diseases. Then the normal overall sex ratio, that is, if you looked at all ages and you looked at the sex ratio, that would be about 98 to 99 men per 100 women. And this is due, of course, to the greater longevity, generally speaking, of women in a population. They live longer. All right, with those in mind, let's take sort of a survey of what's going on in the world. I'll put this up as high as I can. Let's see if you can read it. Is it better, worse? You're right, you need a new overhead. If we look at the overall sex ratios of the world's population in the year 2000, broken down by continent there, you'll see that normal ratios are to be found in Africa, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in North America, although it's slightly lower there. That's due to exaggerated longevity, much longer lifespan in North America than many other countries. You will see abnormal overall sex ratios in Asia, where the sex ratio is 104.4. You will see an abnormal ratio in Europe, where it's 93.1 males per 100 females. Europe is actually experiencing a dearth of males, whereas Asia is experiencing a dearth of females. And then in Oceania, you get the less exaggerated but still abnormal ratio of 100.8 males per 100 females overall. Now let's look at that early childhood, or 0 to 4 ratio. Okay. We see mostly normal ratios, although Africa is a little lower. It seems that more boys appear to be dying in Africa than in other places. Mostly normal, but look there at Asia, 106.9 for the early childhood there. And now let's take a look at birth sex ratios. This one didn't Xerox as well as I would like. That first nation is China. We have an expected sex ratio of about 105 at birth. Reported sex ratios anywhere from a low of about 116 to a high of about 120, 121. In certain areas of China, they have documented sex ratios of 160 and above. That is 160 boys being born per 100 girls. In India, the expected sex ratio, according to demographers, should be 103.9. In India, you get everything from a 111 up to 156 documented in the literature. South Korea also has somewhat of a problem. It's becoming less over time, but about a decade ago, the birth-sex ratios were about 117, 118. Now they're down to about 109, which is still skewed, but not quite as bad as it used to be. Taiwan also has a slightly skewed sex ratio, again about 109, about on a par with South Korea. Now, I'm sure that many of you might understand, well, let's not use the word understand. I'm sure that many of you could at least state reasons why girls' lives would be less valued in some of these societies. Let's never understand, because understanding implies some degree of acceptance. But let's at least suggest some reasons why the lives of girls are not as valued in some of these societies. Here are several reasons that researchers have put forward. One, of course, is the labor value of women. In certain societies where male labor is the predominant labor that supports the family, in areas where large livestock are kept or where heavy plowing is necessary, the labor of women is undervalued. In areas where women's labor makes up a larger part of the sustenance of the family, especially in rice-growing regions, silk-growing regions, girls may be more valued for their labor. Oftentimes in these societies, dowry is paid because the male labor is considered so important. Females are then seen as a burden that must be accepted, and so the bride's family must pay money to the groom's family to take that burden off their hands. A second reason, of course, is lineage. Most of these societies are what we would call patrilocal societies, where the bride will leave her family and move in with her husband's family, usually a large extended family consisting of grandparents, parents, brothers, and so forth, who own the land. And in these types of cultures then, especially since girls are married fairly young, usually between 13 and 16, then the bride's family begins not to view her as a member of the family. There are numerous proverbs such as, raising a daughter is like watering a plant in another man's garden, and suggesting that she is a house guest in her family, and that she really belongs to the family of the others. And so again, if she is not viewed as a member of the family, then she's not really valued. When she is born, it's as if a stranger is being born into the household. There are other tales to tell. Some of the religious traditions in this area of the world may suggest that if a young child is killed, that is not really a murder because they were not fully a human being yet. Usually around age 2, they're considered a full human being. But before age 2, if something happens to them, then it's not considered necessarily a full-fledged murder. Sometimes women are part of this rationalization because it is almost always the mothers and mothers-in-law that do the actual female infanticide. Some women wonder why a daughter should suffer, as she, the mother, has suffered throughout her life. Some women actually believe that abortion is too costly. In certain rural areas, female infanticide is preferred because it is actually less costly than sex-selective technology. Now, of course, in India and China and all of these countries, to select against daughters, either in utero or once they are born, is strictly illegal. In fact, doctors giving you ultrasound results that indicate the sex of your fetus is strictly illegal. But the motivation to have sons and to not have daughters is so strong that you can understand how these laws may be easily circumvented. If the doctor lights up a cigarette, that means you have a boy. If he doesn't light up a cigarette, it means you have a girl. There are ways of communicating that knowledge without running afoul in any observable way from what's going from the law. Now, let's look here at where most of the quote-unquote missing women are. Looking here at but 7 Asian nations, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, China, India, Pakistan, South Korea, and Taiwan, you will see that these 7 nations contribute over 90 million missing women from Asia. Of course, the vast majority of these missing women are missing from the populations of China and India because of the vastness of their populations. This is a conservative estimate. Other demographers believe that well over 100 million women were not born in Asia that should have been born. Now, on one side of the coin is the missing women. The other side of the coin of this phenomenon in the world is, of course, the surplus men that are produced. Okay? Any time that you alter the balance of population in a society to the degree that has been done here, you will then have men who are surplus. That is, families have already killed the women that should have grown up to become their wives one day. So the question is asked then about how many surplus males are we looking at? Let's first look at India here. We've made two projections, one conservative and one that we believe is probably more accurate. We're projecting out to the year 2020. By the year 2020, in the age group 15 to 35, and why would we look at 15 to 35? Well, we're about to tell you that. Okay, looking just at the age group 15 to 35, in India, you're looking at a minimum of 28,326,000 surplus males, and probably more accurately, over 31 million young adult surplus males. In China, the figures are comparable. For the Chinese case, again, ages 15 to 35 out to the year 2020, you're looking at least 29 million and probably over 33 million young adult surplus males. Okay? In human history, there has never been this number of surplus males in these societies before. Okay? It's really unprecedented here. Okay. So now we would like to ask ourselves, I'm sure you know where we're going with this, so what? Okay? So you have over 30 million young adult surplus males, which in China are called bare branches. That is, those branches of the family tree that will never bear fruit because the boys will never become married. Why should it matter? Well, we believe that there's a link to security. And we believe that these nations in Asia, especially China, are beginning to understand what has been wrought with the skewedness of the sex ratios. We believe that there is a link to both internal security as well as regional security in the area. Now, we are not going to claim that just having surplus males is going to lead to such internal and external instability. But the presence of these bare branches, using the metaphor that's natural to use here, if a fire is going to start, the fire is going to spread quicker and be larger if there's a large number of bare branches than otherwise. Okay? But this is not a determinative factor. The sex ratio of Rwanda in the mid-90s, where that horrible genocide took place, was normal. So just because you have a normal sex ratio doesn't mean that your society is necessarily more stable. But if you have tens of millions of surplus young males, you are definitely going to have a stability problem. How it manifests itself remains to be seen. What is the problem with young adult unmarried males? Should I ask that at BYU? Is there a problem with young adult unmarried males who have no prospects of being married? Yes, sir.
They lack motivation.
To do what?
Positive.
Okay, positive things. That's very kind of you to say that. I appreciate that. It is true. Young men, according to the scientific researchers, you young unmarried males have a very high level of circulating or serum testosterone. This is very useful to you because in past days you needed to compete for the resources to attract a mate. However, this is all well and good as long as you one day have a mate. When a male makes a commitment to a female, a stable commitment to a female, which is usually exemplified in marriage, his serum testosterone level will drop. So even you engaged persons, young men, in the room have lower circulating T than the fellow sitting next to you who is not engaged. If one day you became divorced, your serum T level would again go up, which It probably accounts for some of the bizarre behavior of divorced older men, right? Their serum T levels are going up after years of being low, and they don't know what to do with it. All right. Now, in societies such as India and China, okay, this is going to create an interesting kind of class dynamic. These unmarried males, by and large, are going to be low-status males, okay? Because any male who has any advantage, whether he comes from a wealthier family, he has education, he has skills, he has looks, okay, all of those men are going to marry, okay, because women can, or at least women's families can afford to be a little bit choosier. So the ones who are going to remain unmarried are going to be at the lowest level of society. Low status males, generally less literate, less skilled, less employed, and more transient. Now, what is the behavioral syndrome for young adult unmarried males? I don't know. What's a BYU apartment filled with unmarried young adult males like? What do you do for fun? Well, of course, BYU is a little weird, but, you know, what do you do for fun?
Mario Kart.
What's that?
Mario Kart.
Mario Kart? Okay. All right. I don't even know what that is. A game. Okay. Okay. Sports. Okay. Do you do a lot of hanging out with the guys when you can't get a date? Do a lot of hanging out with the guys? And fun is playing things like Monopoly, right? No? For one or two of you. All right, what researchers have found is that young adult males do tend to congregate. And when they congregate, they tend to experience fun as engaging in riskier behavior than any single one of them in the group would do if they were alone. Okay? So groups of males, groups of unattached young males, tend to engage in riskier and less legal, shall we say, behavior than any single one of them would alone. They are also much more likely to engage in vice and also substance abuse. Young adult unmarried males are much more likely to abuse alcohol and drugs than young adult married males, and also, of course, to visit prostitutes and other types of behavior. They are also much more violent. The chances that a young adult male will kill another male is 3 times higher for those who are unmarried. And they are many more times likely to engage in robbery, theft, rape, and also risky behaviors such as driving under the influence, much more likely to get into traffic accidents and so forth. In other words, a pattern of much riskier behavior. Now, in a societal context, this may be something the society can handle and absorb. All societies must. However, in societies where you're going to have tens of millions of young adult males who will never be able to marry, then you are going to get a sort of bigger picture of this kind of bare branch syndrome of behavior, and it will persist longer. What we see historically in some of these societies is a pattern of coalitional aggression, where young, low-status, unmarried males form gangs. And sometimes these gangs evolve into small armies led by a charismatic leader. And sometimes these small armies actually coalesce into larger armies. In all cases, the bare branches become a force for grave societal instability, which may have international repercussions. One interesting case that we looked at about a half dozen historical cases, is the Nian Rebellion that took place between 1851 and 1863 in China. This wasn't the only rebellion going on in poor China at this particular instance, but it was one of the most serious rebellions. The Nian, as they call themselves, came from the Huaipei region of China, which is a very poor region with agriculture that occasionally collapses into periods of famine. In one of those periods of famine, parents saved their sons and allowed their daughters to die at a level much higher than they had done in previous years, which resulted in an overall sex ratio in this region of 129 men to 100 women, which is extremely skewed. As these surplus young males or bare branches grew up, they did go through the same kind of pattern. They first formed gangs, smuggling gangs, vice gangs, and so forth. That then turned into small, littler armies that then coalesced and became the Nien Army. The Nien Army actually took on the emperor, and they fought for many years until the emperor, modernizing his army and importing soldiers from other areas, were able to put down the Nien. Around this time, about 1/4 of young males were not able to get married. Looking at these historical case studies and the theoretical research that's been done on young unmarried male behavior, as a political scientist, I step back and I say to myself, if we had a country with 33 million young adult surplus males, what kinds of effects would that have on security? Well, I think one of the projections that we make, and which has been borne out in historical research, is that when you have large numbers of bare branches, you can't afford to be democratic, or at least not as democratic as we would understand democracy in the United States. Okay? Because of the rising crime and the instability, you need a heavier hand. And this heavier hand is going to derail some of the prospects for full-blown democracy. Second, these governments need to try to attract the allegiance of the bare branches. But a government can't do that unless it's willing to undertake at least rhetoric that is consistent with what young adult unmarried males would respect. So we tend to get quite a bit of bellicose rhetoric from such nations, and such nations become extremely sensitive to any sort of insults. This kind of behavior is intended to garner the allegiance of the bare branches, who are looking to see that their government is as strong and as macho as they are. This also becomes a factor in ethnic strife, as we see in India. Many of these bare branches are recruits to hardline nationalist forces in India, such as the pro-Hindu party, and may be used to create ethnic strife. Third, another need of governments that have large numbers of bare branches within their borders is to get these bare branches away from large population centers. But of course, that's naturally where these young men congregate. Okay? There's greater anonymity, more opportunity, as they see it, in the large metropoles. However, the government's desire will be to get them away from those large metropolitan areas. They may encourage migration to the hinterlands or new frontiers of their country, as China's attempting to do to get young men to move to the western regions of Xinjiang and also to Tibet. They may also encourage migration abroad to other countries, whether that migration be legal or illegal. Another common response of these governments, we call them high sex ratio governments, governments that are dealing with a high sex ratio in their society, is to create large public works projects away, again, from the metropolitan areas. So the Three Gorges dams, the huge new system of canals and natural gas pipelines that are being constructed in China, are being constructed mostly near the center or the west, away from the coastal population centers, using old-fashioned low technology that attracts many young unmarried male workers. Lastly, another strategy that has been used by high sex ratio governments in the past has been to send the young men abroad on military adventures. This was actually used quite a bit in Europe There was a time period in which Europe went through the same phenomenon of selection against daughters, resulting in a lot of young adult unmarried men. For example, Portugal in the 1500s, they had a sex ratio of something like 125 males per 100 females. The King of Portugal decided that he would have kind of a new crusade against the Holy Land. So he gathered up all the young, unattached young males and sent them off to the Holy Land. Was he hoping they would come back? He was actually hoping they would not come back, okay? That they would die in glory in battle somewhere, would make them happy and make him happy, make everybody happy. Now, we are not suggesting that China and India are going to gather huge armies and send them out to do battle. However, let's remember this. By the year 2020, when we're talking about situations such as the standoff across the Taiwan Strait, do you think it will be important to know that China will have at least 33 million young adult surplus males that it's not sure what to do with? Might that be a factor in the deliberations about what to do with Taiwan, especially if the U.S. falters in its policy of deterrence? How about India and Pakistan? We haven't looked at Pakistan per se because it has smaller numbers, but some demographers argue that Pakistan actually has worse sex ratios than either India or China. So here we have two nations, India and Pakistan, who have in the past threatened even nuclear war against one another, whose governments are facing the problem of what to do with all of these surplus young men, whom they wish would just simply disappear somehow. Might that be a factor in what happens in the future? It may well be, because it may be that these governments will see that the greatest threat to their society is not the other nation, but rather this large army of surplus young men. So to go back to the beginning of my lecture, is there a linkage between how society treats women and the security of that society? Yes, there is. Okay? If you kill your daughters, if you sow the east wind, you will reap the whirlwind. This is appropriate. This is an example of divine justice. And this is something I think will increasingly be on the radar screens of nations over the next several decades. Thank you very much. I would be happy to take any questions that you might have. Yes, sir. Ben, right?
Yeah. I know you're not a scientist. You're probably not an expert on serum testosterone. But how might that affect countries like America that are starting to kind of mitigate the importance of marriage? How might testosterone increase?
You know, that's a wonderful question. Ben asked, what about societies where marriage for young people is now actively discouraged, where transient hookups are encouraged? I agree with you. You will see the same phenomenon. Okay? What's very interesting is you see, for instance, Russia, where they have a deficit of 24 million men. Russia is actually facing some of the same criminal gang activity. Now, they don't have surplus men. They have a deficit of men. Okay? The problem when you have a deficit of men is that men do not need to make a commitment to women in order to have sexual access to women. In that case, as you see, the serum testosterone remains high. You get the same type of unstable behavior. Of course, you're not going to get any sort of army adventurousness abroad because, there are not enough men for the army. But isn't it interesting, when you have too few men and you get a lack of commitment to women, you get the same problems as when you have too many men who can't make a commitment to women even though they would like to. Isn't it wonderful that the normal state of affairs is to have approximately as many women as there are men? And that is a strong foundation for all society. When you play with that, you're playing with fire. Yes, sir.
Would you please wait for the microphone?
What's been the trend?
with the population ratios over the last 20 years, and what's the expected future trend? Are they increasing in those countries or decreasing, moving towards 1-to-1? Or
You mean in the Asian countries we've looked
yeah,
at?
the 7 Asian countries.
In China and India, they are still getting worse. In Taiwan and Korea, they are getting better. Japan used to have a big problem with this, but has not generally had a problem with abnormal sex ratios in the 20th century. But no, India and China, Pakistan, Bangladesh are all getting worse. Yes, ma'am.
Are they getting worse simply because they can't change the minds of the people? It's a mindset now that it's just been established for so many.
Yes, that's right. Even though it's absolutely illegal, the courts have invaded against it. Politicians proclaim they're going to crack down on it. Society says, gosh, we have to have more women, but it's kind of like, okay, we need to have more women, but not in my family. Somebody else needs to be doing it. And of course, in China, you have the added factor of the one-child policy. If you're only allowed one child, by golly, it's going to be a boy. And you're going to use whatever means you have to in order to obtain that boy. So yes, it's a real mindset problem. It's not a legal problem. It's a cultural problem.
Well, what about the governments in those areas? Are they now trying to address the issue?
Absolutely. Absolutely, they've been trying to address the issue. However, the cost-benefit equation is still such that every family feels that it loses if it has a daughter and gains if it has a son. Until that incentive structure becomes different somehow, you're going to get this. People are going to go around the law to do whatever they have to do to get that son and heir.
With economic development, there's a lot of disparity between wealthy and poor. How does this complicate the issue?
It's very interesting. I have seen something a little different between China and India. Believe it or not, in India, the wealthier and more educated you are, the worse your birth-sex ratios are, because you can afford it. You can afford to have what you want. Okay. In China, what we find is the wealthier, more educated have better sex ratios. Presumably because perhaps in their more secular society, once the economic incentives are changed for them, maybe they can more easily change the cultural incentives. I'm not sure. But that is a very strange difference between India and China. The higher you go in society in India, the worse the birth-sex ratios. The higher you go in society in China, the better the sex ratios.
Have you looked into the connection between the type of government that's in place and the attitude that gives towards either friendly relations or hostility towards neighbors, and I guess the presence of a large number of these bear branches in that country, whether that is going to the part that could also play in the aggression or the
Definitely. Definitely in India you have this pro-Hindu nationalist party, the BJP party, in power. They're very much into Hindu power, making India a player on the world stage. And there have been so many clashes with Pakistan, and it's so scary for security analysts to look and see that it is, if you're going to have the first nuclear war anywhere, it would probably be there. And because there's so many people living there in such a high density of population per territory, that you would probably have egregious casualties as a result. And so, yeah, absolutely. You get pro-nationalist parties in power, they're going to use their bear branches probably to a greater extent than other types of countries.
What have been the most effective policies at normalizing birth ratios?
The most effective policy is Social Security for the elderly. And that may seem counterintuitive, but if you think about it, one of the reasons you really want those sons is that in these cultures it is the son's responsibility to take care of his parents. In fact, they're probably living with him, right? In areas in China where they have done experiments providing old age insurance to all the elderly, the sex ratios begin to normalize, because then there's no tangible payoff for having that boy. Now, of course, in India, that's complicated by the dowry system, where the dowry to marry a girl, even when girls are scarce. Hey, there's over 16 million surplus young adult males in India today. But even with the scarcity of females, you still have to pay a humongous dowry to marry a girl. Now, the economists might tell you, well, that's crazy. Well, yeah, it is crazy, because it's culture. It's not economics. It's not rational.
Valerie, I haven't made a statistical survey of this, but in talking to people in China, taxi cab drivers and others, I sense that some of them realize, as I did with 5 girls and 3 boys, that girls bond to their family and take care of the parents better than the boys do in later life.
It's funny you should mention that, Paul, because in recent years the Chinese government has actually attempted to put up billboards. And you see these 2 elderly women talking to each other, and one of the elderly women has a young girl massaging her back. And the unmassaged elderly woman says, I have 3 sons, and they don't take care of me half as well as your daughter. And the elderly woman with the daughter says, yes, that's right. I'm so grateful for my daughter. What a blessing she has been to me. You know, and you're right. In the metropolitan areas where the girl does not have to move far away and live with her husband, and where nuclear families are more likely to be the norm, in metropolitan areas, that's right. People are seeing that girls are actually willing to give hands-on service to their elderly parents. But it hasn't yet completely swayed the population, because the birth-sex ratios are worse than they've ever been. So this young lady in green has had her hand up for a long time.
I read an article in Times Magazine, and it referred to China. It was saying that many times they're like marrying between siblings, so that kind of thing, like, because there is so difficult to get a girl to marry a guy in an urban area where there is not many population. So I was wondering, do you know about this?
I'm sorry, say that again. Time Magazine was saying what now?
That it's very difficult to get a girl to
Yes.
marry in an area where it's mostly farming or something like that, so that they are like marrying between siblings or like
Well, I've never heard of-
cousins or something like that.
Well, I'm sure there might be some marriage between cousins. A worse phenomenon is kidnapping and sale of women, where women go to what they think is some sort of job interview in the city. They're kidnapped. They're trucked out to heaven knows where, and they are sold. We're even seeing the sale of girl infants, where infants, in fact, they found plastic bags. Can you believe it? Plastic bags stuffed full of girl infants on a bus going from the metropole out to the farming communities. These girls were going to be sold to families who had a son but wanted to make sure they got a girl that they could raise up to be his bride. So even girl babies now, because you pay less for a girl baby than you do for an adult woman. And the adult woman's going to want to escape and go back, and there'll be trouble with the police. But if you buy a girl baby, you can raise her up to be your son's wife. It's just horrible.
Addressing this issue at home, and with this I mean BYU, you were talking about Russia, some deficit of men, and probably, I don't know if it's true, deficit of men here too. Have you seen that?
So that's why men
syndrome?
can be more players now at BYU, huh?
Have you seen that syndrome?
Well,
here,
girls,
or?
don't you stand for that. If men are taking that attitude, all of you gang up and refuse to play the game. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's true. If I understand there are more women at BYU than men, and so men can afford to be players. Shame on you if you do. Yes, sir.
Is there more instance of like rape and stuff because the
Yes.
men need more sexual gratification and all that?
Well, yes. Both rape and homosexuality do increase when you get large numbers of bare branches. That's correct. Anyone else? Good. You've had enough? Go forth. Have fun.